So there's a little bit of a video clip that I'd like to show you all, because it's relevant to what I wanted to share.
So we're walking through the Gospel of Luke, and we've reached the end of Jesus' long road trip to Jerusalem. He's arrived.
So he rides a donkey down the Mount of Olives towards the city, and all these crowds are forming, and people are singing, "Praise the King who comes in the name of the Lord." They're laying down their cloaks in front of him.
Why all this royal treatment?
Okay, so Israel's ancient prophets promised that one day God himself would arrive and rescue his people and rule the world. Other times, the prophet spoke about a coming king who would ride into Jerusalem to bring justice and peace.
So Jesus is activating all these hopes that he's that king, and everyone's ecstatic.
Well, not everybody. The religious leaders, they think Jesus is a threat to their power, and so they're not happy. But even more striking, Jesus himself is distraught. He's actually weeping as he rides.
Yeah, why?
Well, Jesus can see what is coming. He knows that he won't be accepted as Israel's king, and he knows that Israel will keep going down a destructive path, neglecting the poor, stirring up rebellion against their Roman oppressors, and he knows that it will lead to death. It breaks his heart.
And it riles him up. The first thing he does in Jerusalem is march into the temple courts, and he drives out the money changers, disrupting the entire sacrificial system.
Yeah, he's staging a prophetic protest, and he stands in the center of the courtyard, shouting out words from Israel's ancient prophets. This is supposed to be a place of worship, but you've made it a den of rebels.
A den of rebels?
Yeah, he's quoting from the prophet Jeremiah, who stood in this same spot, the center of Israel's religious and political power. And he offered the same critique of Israel's leaders, that they're rebellious and corrupt.
And they get the message and start to plan to have him killed.
Which is no surprise to Jesus. In fact, he planned that all of this would happen during Passover.
This is the Holy Week when Jewish people celebrate their ancient story of how God liberated them from slavery and invited them into a covenant relationship.
And so Jesus uses the symbols of Passover to reveal the meaning of his coming death. The broken bread was his broken body, and the wine was his blood that would establish a new covenant relationship between God and Israel. Jesus was going to die for his people and open up a new way forward.
After the meal, Jesus takes his disciples to a garden to pray.
And he struggles with the very human desire to save his life instead of sacrificing it, but he overcomes this temptation.
And it's here where the religious leaders, with the temple guards, find him and arrest him.
Now, Jerusalem was being ruled by the Roman Empire, and so the temple leaders couldn't execute Jesus without permission from their Roman governor, a man named Pontius Pilate. And so they make up this charge that Jesus is a rebel king stirring up revolution against the Roman emperor.
Pilate asks Jesus, "Are you the king of the Jews?"
And Jesus answers, "You say so."
So Pilate can see that Jesus is an innocent man and he doesn't deserve death.
But the leaders keep insisting that he is dangerous, so they negotiate a compromise. Pilate will release an actual rebel against Rome, a man named Barabbas, instead of Jesus. And so the innocent is handed over in the place of the guilty.
Jesus is taken away with two other accused criminals and nailed to a Roman execution device. And people are mocking him. Hey, if you're the Messianic king, save yourself and us.
But Jesus loved his enemies to the very end, offering hope to one of the criminals dying beside him. And he even prayed for his executors. "Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing."
And then the sky darkened as an innocent man died the death of a rebel.
And then Jesus cried out with ancient words from Israel's Psalms, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." And then Jesus died, innocent and alone.
Is it against the Romans? No.
The Jewish leaders, they were jealous of him all along. They were jealous of him, and they didn't like the fact that he confronted them, and he often confronted their bad practices, the things that they were doing that were not good. And they decided they had to get rid of him. Ultimately, he was doing a lot of really good things, miracles, helping people who were sick, healing them, people who were oppressed by spiritual forces, darkness. He was liberating them, setting them free, and through that, he got to have a very become popular, basically a big following, and the religious leaders got very jealous. They decided we have to put him away, basically. So they concocted some sort of plan to have him arrested. They did it all against their own rules. According to their own rules, they're not supposed to have a trial in secret, which they did. They're not supposed to have a trial where you don't have representation, which they did. Jesus wasn't represented. He had just himself. They weren't supposed to have, there were supposed to be witnesses and fair witnesses on both sides. Jesus didn't have a witness, and the witnesses who were against him, they told lies. They brought false witnesses, and their lies were so obvious that the religious leaders said, these lies are just so obvious that they can't stick, they can't really stand. So none of that worked, yet still they were determined to put him away. So what they decided to do was to shove him off to Pilate. Pilate at the time was a Roman governor for the area, and according to their rules, they were not allowed to put anybody to death. The Romans had come up with this rule that in all our empire, nobody is supposed to kill somebody. Only we have the right to do that, the Romans, which was a very cruel thing to do. So what the Jewish leaders did basically is say, well, we'll shove him off to Pilate. And they took him off to Pilate. Pilate tried to see if there was any reason why this man should be put to death, but Pilate couldn't find any. According to Roman law, there was no reason why Jesus should be put to death. So Pilate then turns out and says, this man's innocent. I don't see any reason why he should be put to death. But what he decided to do, because he tried to appease the religious leaders, tried to keep the peace, because the Jewish leaders were basically evoking a riot. They were trying to get the crowds riled up and whatever. So Pilate thought, well, if I flog Jesus to within a whisker of his life, hopefully that will appease the Jewish leaders, the religious leaders, and that would be me off the hook. We don't have to put him to death. So they did that. They whipped him. They scourged him really to the point of almost a whisker within his death. Still, the religious leaders were not satisfied with this, and they insisted. They shouted, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" So he was then led away and put on a cross beside a hill. It's a historically proven fact. There was a historian at the time by the name of Josephus who actually has attested to these events, to the fact that at the time that Jesus lived, there was a man going around in that particular part of the world, basically doing good deeds and setting people free, and he was killed by the religious leaders. This is a historian, a non-believing historian actually, who attested to this. Now, the thing that I wanted to speak about is, why did he have to do all of that? Why did he have to go through all of that heartache, really? Why did Jesus have to go through all of that? Bear in mind, this was somebody who, at the command of his voice, he could raise somebody who was dead. So in a way, there was nothing impossible for him. At the command, at the behest of his voice, he could feed 5,000 men plus women and children, probably 15,000 people, at the drop of a hat, just like that. So he had immense ability within himself, yet here he is putting himself in the hands of cruel people who were really mean and horrible and unjust and wicked, and he puts himself completely in their hands. And the big question that we would all ask is, why? Why would Jesus do that? And the answer, the simple answer, and this is what I kind of wanted to speak about today, really, I want to hopefully keep it short today, is he wanted that there will be no hindrance between you and God. He died so that we could be forgiven. He died so that the bad things that we do, all of us do bad things. Anybody here perfect? No. It is one of those things that you will notice.
No one's perfect, just newborn babies.
Even newborn babies are not really perfect. If you leave a newborn baby, very often they can be quite manipulative sometimes. Yeah, exactly. They can be like,
I was silent.
exactly.
I was silent.
And they know how to get what they want sometimes, so they can be very cunning. It is very true with newborn babies. It is, in fact, it's a commonly known thing that you do not have to teach children to do wrong. There is just this thing within us all, that actually we do inherently within us. There is a thing that just pushes us towards doing wrong. And so that thing within us, that thing that is, it's basically what the Bible calls sin. Sin is everything that is contrary to God's nature. God is perfect. We just sang, you are perfect in all of your ways. And God is perfect, and He's good in that perfection. Everything that He intends for humanity, for you and I, is for our good. However, there is this annoying thing called sin that basically means that we do wrong, and because we do wrong, there has to be a consequence. I remember when I was growing up, my parents would very often tell me, you are heading the right way of a good smacking, basically.
That's my mum. That's my mum.
That's your mom, exactly. You are heading down the road of a good smacking, basically.
Smack of your life.
And why did they do that? Because, yes, they wanted to bring me up proper. They hopefully wanted to instruct me what was right and what was wrong. But also they wanted to teach me an important lesson, that actually when we do wrong, there is a consequence. There is a consequence. Sometimes we might not feel it immediately. It might take a while to come into, to kick in, but there is always a consequence when we do wrong. And what Jesus went through, the reason He went through what He went through was God was basically saying, why doesn't He take the consequences for all the bad things that every human being has done, from Adam right to the very end, every single human being, and I forgive the whole lot of you. I forgive the whole lot of you, because there has to be justice. There has to be this sense that actually the wrong things that are going on in this world demand justice. There's a cry even in the hearts of ordinary human beings like us. There's a cry in us. I remember there was a lady who I saw in the news ages ago. Her daughter was killed by some gunmen, and she said she went to court, and she had to go through the whole court process because something in her was crying out for justice. Something in her was saying, no, there has to be a righting of the wrongs. But even after she sat there and saw the person who killed her daughter put to prison, she said it still wasn't enough. It somehow didn't satiate, it didn't fulfill, it didn't satisfy. There was still something in her left knowing, something that was left kind of like, it's still unfair, it's still unfair. I'm left here without my daughter, and there he's allowed to carry on his life. And so there was a lot that basically was still left out of kilter. And what Jesus did, really, the offer that God is offering all of us as human beings, really, is that Jesus pays the ultimate justice. Why? Because number one, He is innocent. He was innocent. He didn't deserve to do it. It had to be somebody innocent for the scales really to be righted, for everything to be made back right. So Jesus did it in our place. He's the only person who walked this earth who could claim to be perfect. His accusers could not find any wrong in Him. They tried to find wrong in Him. And even Pilate, who ultimately sentenced Him, said, this is an innocent man. He actually proclaimed over Jesus that this is an innocent man. So in what Jesus did, He did all of that so that God's plan, God's solution is that Jesus pays for all the bad things that we have done, and we get let off. We literally get let off. There's an English saying, it says scot-free, apparently. God's plan, in a nutshell, and if there's something that I'd like you all to take away from here, it is that for all the bad things that we do, all the bad things that we've ever done, that Jesus pays for it, and we get let off completely. We get forgiven.
Abandoned.
However, we have to accept that. We have to respond to it. There were times I remember when I did wrong, when I was growing up, and my parents would say to me, here's the deal. We will forgive you this time. But then they would observe my behavior. Because if I took that forgiveness for granted and repeated the same thing again, they were like, okay, he's taking us for a bit of a ride, isn't he? He's taking the mickey. He's basically whatever. So in the same way, really, with all of us, that actually, even though there is a desire to extend forgiveness, if we reject that desire, that offer of forgiveness from God, that actually the thing is that we could actually end up losing what's being offered to us if we decide that's not something I want to receive. And we can do that by our actions. I remember there were times when I was being punished, and my parents were like, well, if you don't do this again, here's the deal. We'll call it quits. You don't have to do X, Y. My parents, I've mentioned this to the guys who are here, they had very creative punishments, basically. Very creative punishments, yeah, exactly. One of them was to stand by the door for an hour. Yes, exactly. I had the naughty chair. Anybody have a naughty chair when they were growing up? A naughty step?
I wanted to chuck it away.
You wanted to chuck it away?
I was in school and they had it in school.
Yeah. And
Not
so you
even
want...
at my house, it was in
Do you
school.
remember one day, George, doing a naughty step and there was a snail behind it?
snail.
Don't know how. I think it was really scratchy and our steps was never
I hate snails.
You freaked out.
I hate
So scared of snails.
So my parents had very creative ones. I mean, some of them were literally like very, very, what's the word? Strict. Yeah, exactly. Like basically, no son of mine will behave like that in this house. Exactly. This is what this is. You're all going, I'm sure my parents were not thinking that at the time. They were really thinking, he needs to listen to this. But basically, they would often offer me. They would often be strict, but there'd often be a little bit of a if you show a sign of taking responsibility, if you show that you're actually willing to own up to what you've done wrong, that actually they would let me off. So, for example, there was once, I think I've mentioned this to some of you guys, there was once when my dad came home one day with a new car.
We must stop it.
Have I ever told you this story? Dad went and bought a nice new shiny Volvo, came home with it one day. You remember this story, yeah?
Yeah, you smashed it with a catapult.
Exactly, and I was there with my brother, and we were playing. We had this thing, we loved making catapults and hitting birds with the catapults.
How did you make the catapult?
It was, we used bits of like, what we used to call rubber band. Do you know what rubber band is? Yeah. But like an elastic band. But then we had ones that were made out of stronger rubber, like the inner bit of a car tire. So like the really inside bit, really strong stuff, and bits of stick. Anyhow, we used to make these catapults, and we used to basically hit birds, try and hit birds. And there was one day when I decided I could see this hawk that was kind of hovering over the top, and I thought, oh, this is a great one, and I flung this stone towards this hawk. Unbeknown to myself was that everything that goes up has to do what? Has to come back down. And guess what? Of all the places the stone chose to do it, it chose to pick my dad's new car. And it chose to hit the windscreen, of all places. So there was this big crack along the windscreen. Dad's probably forgotten about it. I don't know.
Good.
It was a good aim, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Well, the thing is, I was so petrified by what I did, because I was thinking this is like gonna be the ultimate punishment. What I actually did, I spent the whole afternoon before Dad came back from work thinking, what shall I say to him? What shall I say to him? What shall I say to him? And then he came from work, and I decided, before he has a chance to come to me, I will go to him. And I will tell him first. And so I ran to him, and I said, Dad, I have something to tell you. And I said, what?
He was expecting good news. It's very sweet when a child does that as a parent.
It is, isn't it? It's amazing.
It melts my heart.
The reason it matters so much to a parent when a child does that is because it shows that they are willing to take responsibility. And that act of being able to take responsibility for your actions, it's the same thing that our Creator is looking forward from us. Whilst his desire is to forgive us of everything, there is something in him that is longing for us to take responsibility for the bad things that we have done. For us to be able to come back to him and say, actually, God, I'm not perfect. I acknowledge the fact that I do bad things, and I want to take ownership of the bad things that I've done, and I want to ask that you forgive me for the bad things that I've done. And do you know what? Dad let me off. He let me off. I didn't have to be punished that day. I was like, after I was so whatever.
He had courage to come to tell
It had to be courageous. Yeah, I know. The interesting thing was he stayed with the windscreen crack for a long while. It was as if it was kind of a reminder, Dennis. Next time. So what I want to speak to you about is this amazing thing that God wants to extend to human beings, and that's called forgiveness. His desire is he doesn't want to hold anything against us. He is holy, and actually his standards are way above our standards. There is no way we could meet them. Me talking about me trying to reach to appease my dad. God's standards are way, way more whatever. That none of us really, if it were down to us, God would be all the time disappointed in us, all the time demanding of us that there be justice.
Yeah, that's nice.
But his desire is to forgive, so that all the bad things that we do will not count against us anymore. Now, there is something that we are being expected to do as well in response to that. Number one is to take responsibility. It's to take responsibility for the bad things that we've done. Number two, Jesus taught us, in a prayer, in the Lord's Prayer, he said, Our Father in heaven. The last bit of the prayer, he said, forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. In other words, actually me extending out that forgiveness to somebody else is a way in which I say, God, I want you to forgive me. Now, all of us, in addition to the fact that we do wrong, we have been wronged against. I haven't come across any human being who's never been wronged against. And what God is wanting of us is to do this thing that is, to be honest, sometimes very difficult, and that is that we forgive even as he has forgiven us. That is the only way that actually the wrong things that are done against us do not end up sticking with us. That actually, as people do bad things against us, we can actually walk through life with those bad things stuck on us. Somebody did this to me. Somebody did this to me.
Carry that heavy weight.
And actually they can end up becoming a burden that ends up inhibiting my ability to live. They can even end up affecting my health, my physical health. I'll tell you an amazing story of a lady who was paralyzed and she was in a wheelchair. And the doctors said they'd done all that they could for her. Basically, she was in a wheelchair and she had been in a wheelchair for a number of years, and she came forward. At the time I was working for Ministry, and she came forward for prayer, for ministry, for prayer really is the best way to put it. And we gave her a task, a very simple task. We gave her a piece of paper and we just say to her, is there anybody that you need to forgive in life? And we say to her, just go away, go and think about it overnight. Is there anybody that you need to forgive? And so she went away. She wrote down on this piece of paper all night all the people that she needed to forgive. And she started working through the forgiveness. She came back in the morning without a wheelchair.
Wow.
The wheelchair was gone. This is somebody who was paralyzed, actually paralyzed, and came back in the morning. And in the lawn where we were living in this place, a big Christian retreat house, in the middle of the countryside. In the lawn, she was doing cartwheels. This is a lady that was paralyzed. She was actually doing cartwheels in the lawn. All because we didn't even pray for her, we didn't do anything. All we did was ask her to go and forgive. You know, there's a psychiatrist I know who's actually a famous psychiatrist who said there are something like 70% of people in psychiatric care who would not be there if only they would forgive. If only they would forgive. And so when we don't forgive, what actually happens is we walk with things and they end up hobbling us. Those things end up actually sticking with us. Now, what does it mean to forgive? Because forgiving is a word that's sort of bandied about, and I wanted to just kind of spend a little bit of time to drill into the practicality of what it really means from a biblical perspective, from a Christian perspective, of what it really means to forgive. There are 4 things that forgiveness is, and there are 4 things that forgiveness is not. Now, I'm going to give you this sheet of paper. I'm going to give you this sheet of paper, and it's up to you. You can take it away, you can rubbish it if you want to, or if you want to, you can actually take it away and ponder what's on it. But before I give it to you, I want to actually explain what's on it. Basically, there are 4 things that forgiveness is not, and there are 4 things that forgiving somebody is. Number 1, forgiving somebody is not an emotional thing. It is not an emotional thing. In other words, if you wait till you feel like forgiving somebody, you may never forgive that person. If you wait till you feel like it, it may be one of those things that you'll go to your grave still carrying that anger and that bitterness and that angst that you have towards that person. Forgiving somebody is not an emotion. Forgiving somebody is not necessarily being reconciled to them. So God has forgiven everybody in the world, but it doesn't mean everybody in the world will be reconciled to Him. You can forgive somebody and even report them to the police. It is possible to forgive somebody and still report them to the police. So forgiving somebody doesn't necessarily mean you've got to be reconciled with them. The third thing that forgiveness is not, forgiving somebody is not dependent on what the other person does. So if you wait until the other person deserves to be forgiven, you may find that you never forgive them. Forgiving somebody, from a Christian perspective, it's not dependent. So God forgave all humanity, even though we did not deserve to be forgiven. And there are many people who do not deserve to be forgiven, and yet God's heart, His express intention, is that He wants to hold nothing against anybody, against any person. So forgiveness is nothing really to do with whether the other person deserves it or not. And then lastly, forgiveness is not saying that it doesn't matter, that what they did doesn't matter. Actually, God sees all of us as extremely valuable persons, as extremely precious persons, and everything that's done to us, He is concerned about. Anything that's done to me by anybody, there will come a day when whoever that person does that thing against me, they will have to answer to God, because ultimately I am His creation. I am a creation of His, a precious creation of His. And so there will come a day that actually He will one day have to ask whoever did those things to me what exactly it is. So saying you forgive somebody doesn't mean it doesn't matter. There's some people who say, oh, I've forgiven, and they try and bury the thing under the carpet and say, oh, it doesn't matter. I've moved on. That's it. I need to move on. Well, forgiveness that's not really forgiveness. You can't actually bury something, but that sense of, when I get back to that person, still remains. In that case, you've not fully forgiven them. What is it? So the four things, firstly, that it's not an emotion. It doesn't mean you have to be reconciled with the person. Reconciliation is something else. It is not dependent on what the other person does. And it is not saying that it doesn't matter. What is it? So number one, you know where we said it's not an emotion? It's actually a choice. It's a choice. It's a cold, calculated choice. It's a choice you make that actually this is something I'm going to do. And it's a choice that you actually make for your own self. In a way, it's not really in a way impacting the other person. It's a choice that you're doing for your own self. That lady who walked off the wheelchair, she's not the only one I've seen. I've come across, there's a lady a while back that I prayed with who had back pain to the point that she couldn't sleep. It was getting so bad that she couldn't sleep. And we asked her to just forgive if there was anybody that she needed to forgive. And she remembered somebody 11 years prior to the time that I met her, that was really mean and horrible to her. Somebody who was an employer at work, a boss at work, and this person literally sat on her. I mean, it was like she wasn't allowed to be anything. She was completely just wicked and horrible and cruel. And this lady remembered, oh yeah, that happened to me 11 years ago, and I've never really processed it. Well, that night, we left her to go off and do it herself. She went off and forgave this lady. Guess what? She had a peaceful night's sleep. She woke up by her alarm. She surprised herself because normally she wouldn't sleep. And then normally she would actually hear the alarm as she goes off. But this time, for the first time, it was like, boom. So forgiveness is a choice that you make for yourself. It's your well-being that you're thinking about as you're forgiving. Next thing, forgiveness is not, it doesn't mean you have to be reconciled with the person, but it means you acknowledge before God that this is what has happened to me, this is what they've done to me, but I'm going to let it go and trust you to deal with it. It's acknowledging this is what has been done to me. This is the cost of what's really been done. It's an important part of forgiveness. Is that
courage, isn't it?
you have to, yeah, it takes courage, true. You have to acknowledge the cost in a way, because there's a cost. When somebody does something, if I were to do something bad towards Antoinette, there's immediately an indebtedness. There's the scales are tipped. There's like, I now owe her something. And we use this word in English expression, we say we have to get even.
Yeah.
Because it's like we feel the scales are kind of like, they're sort of wonky. And so I want to get even with the other person to right the scales. But actually what it is, in the sense of what the Bible wants us to do, what God wants us to do, when we forgive somebody, what we are actually saying is, Lord, I want to acknowledge what they have done. This is what they have done. This is what it made me feel. This is the cost it was to me. But here's the deal. I will not demand them to pay me back. I will not demand them to pay me back. I will leave you to deal with them. I will leave you to deal with them on the premise that I am a creation of yours and you know how best to deal with them better than I do. And God will expect it of them. There will come a day when He will expect it of that person. It's the same thing with me, with anybody. If I wrong my wife, there will come a day when God will expect it of me, what exactly it is that I've done towards her. So I have to walk in short accounts. Then the other thing is, and this bit I kind of want to emphasize, it's not really to do with the other person. It's, yes, obviously they're the ones that have done that wrong towards me, but it's for your sake that you forgive. It is really about you. Fundamentally, it's between you and God. It's about you saying, God, I want to acknowledge the fact that I feel this way towards this person, and I don't want this thing to wreck my life. I don't want this thing to mess up my life. I want to actually walk free. I want to be somebody that's free. So it's fundamentally between you and God. And then lastly, I want to say, I've already mentioned this, it's about recognizing, acknowledging the debt that is owed, and then writing off the debt. Writing off the debt. It's saying, God, as far as whatever it is that they owe me, I'm not going to demand of them anymore. I'm not going to demand it of them. I'm not going to demand of them that they pay me back. I'm just going to trust you that you will deal with them, and I will let it go. There's another man, I'll tell you another story. There's a man I prayed for once, talked to, didn't really pray for. This was when I was in Bristol, in a church in Bristol. And he came to me really for counsel, and he was really struggling with depression. He had a really, really strong, heavy depression. And one of the things I like to do really when I'm counseling people is I ask people, when did it start? And what were the circumstances around which it started? Because very often, sometimes the things that we go through, you can often pinpoint a moment when things began to go a little bit awry. So I asked this man, when did it start? And he said, interesting, you should ask me that. But it just so happened, it started at the time when my brother cheated me out of loads of money. He'd saved up loads of money to enter into some sort of deal to buy a house with the brother. The brother cheated him of that money, walked off with the house, left him completely scot-free. He had to borrow some money actually to pay off all the debts that he had to pay off this house, and it left him completely messed up. And he couldn't believe that his own blood brother would do this to him. He was absolutely like, I cannot believe my own brother would do this to me. Well, I said to him, it's painful. It's something that actually, coming to this, sometimes it's when it's people that we expect better of, that people will do better, that it can be most difficult. Well, this man, I said to him, I appreciate what's going on, and I don't fully understand the difficulty of what you're going through because I can't be you. But then what the Bible instructs me to do is to basically encourage you that you need to forgive your brother, because actually you holding on to it is going to mess up your life. Sadly, this man decided he wasn't going to forgive his brother. He decided, this is too much. I cannot do it. I absolutely cannot do it. And as he walked off, he knew he was walking off with that depression, knowing where it started, and he knew the cost that it was going to be for him, and yet he still walked off with that sadness because he could not let go. He could not let go. So this man, the reason I mention him is the fact that it's a choice. It's kind of like it can be one way or another way. The choice is yours or mine as to which way we go. I'm all about practical Christianity. I'm all about being practical with the expression of my faith. So I'm going to give you a piece of paper, and you can rubbish it, you can throw it away if you want. But what I'd like you to do, I've basically on this bit of paper, I've summarized, if you want to grab one and then pass them across, pass it across. I have summarized what I've told you so that you can go away and think about it. If you want to go away and think about it, if you want to, you can stick it in a bit of whatever and chuck it in the bin. It's up to you. On that same piece of paper, it basically says, how does forgiveness works? We are forgiven so that we can forgive. God doesn't expect of us to pass something that we do not already have. God first forgave us so that we then have something that we can then pass on. It would be unfair of God to ask us to do something or to pass on something that we do not have ourselves. I cannot demand of you to give me something if you do not have it. But what God has done in forgiving us is that He has extended to us that forgiveness, and then He's asked of us is that having received, having received that forgiveness, that we too would pass it on. And remember, this is for our sake, that we would pass it on. So we are forgiven so that we can forgive. God's plan is that He pays the debt and that we are forgiven. In the same way, we trust him with what has been done to us, and we forgive. God's plan is that he pays for the debt. When it comes to my sin, he pays the debt, all the bad things that I've done, and then I am let off. In the same way, what he wants me to do towards those who've sinned against me, he wants me to forgive them and trust him with what they have done towards me. Now, who to forgive? Very often it's those that are closest and dearest that will have the most capacity to wound us. That's, in a way, a little bit an obvious thing, really. It doesn't mean the bus driver can't say hurtful things, or it doesn't mean the guy in the Tesco supermarket can't, say really cutting things.
They didn't say
I
know that bus drivers say hurtful things.
Exactly. People do say hurtful things, and sometimes we have to forgive them as well. But it's my experience, and certainly talking to and dealing with a lot of people. Yeah, exactly. Is the people with the most ability to stick the dagger in, the people with the most capacity to really stick the dagger in, are those who we trust, those who we expect that their intentions would be good towards us. So, for example, parents, for example, family, for example, spouses, older sister.
Yeah, because I'm the older sister.
The older sister. Yeah. People that the honest truth is, none of us is perfect. I know because of my imperfections, there's things Lucy has to forgive me for. And in the same way, I have to forgive her for. So none of us is perfect. And so this is, by the way, this is really important. This is not meant to condemn anybody. This is really not meant to condemn anybody.
I have a question.
Yes.
Because you left a small space. What about if you have a long list of people?
Turn over the page. Turn over the page. So the closest and dearest people are those that would have the most capacity to wound us. The second person that I wanted to really highlight is myself. That actually, very often, have you ever had people who say, I can never believe I did that to myself? Or sometimes they say things like, you stupid person, to themselves.
Yeah.
Like when they've done something wrong, you stupid person, how could you possibly do that? Like, you stupid person, how could you possibly whatever or whatever? And what it is basically, sometimes we can be our worst we can be our worst enemies sometimes, basically, in that we sometimes can be the ones that hold ourselves in that place of not being forgiven. And so sometimes we have to forgive ourselves, and sometimes that can be the most difficult thing, is to actually forgive ourselves, because sometimes we hold ourselves by very high standards. And then number 3, God. Sometimes we have to forgive God if we feel life's been unfair and that God is responsible to some degree. I remember speaking about this at Lucy's uncle's church, and one of the ministers in that church said he realized that he had been holding a lot against God because there are so many things that had gone on in his life that he thought were unfair. He basically had been harboring in his heart, he'd been harboring a sense of injustice, that sense of it's not fair towards God. And then he realized he maybe needed to forgive God and actually let God off the hook for his own sake. And when he did that in the midst of lots of tears, as he realized that he'd been holding God in that place. I'm just going to finish off with this. This is what that short prayer says. Now, the way that prayer is crafted is it's helping us to identify the wrong that has been done, to identify the cost to us of that wrong that has been done, and then to allow us to let it go. So that prayer basically says, Dear Jesus, I thank you for dying that I might be forgiven. I now choose to forgive X, Y, and Z because they did X, Y, and Z. This is where you identify the thing that they've done, that you identify the debt, that sense of indebtedness that they've created. And this is what it made me feel. This is kind of how it made me feel. Okay, let me pray. Thank you, Heavenly Father, for this short message, that instruction for us to forgive. Father, it is my prayer that we will take this practically to heart. Jesus taught us to forgive, and he did that knowing that he himself would have to forgive. As we saw in that video, Jesus, you said, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they're doing. I want to ask Jesus that you would teach us, for our own sake, to be able to forgive, to be able to let go of things that we are holding, so that, Lord, we can know the freedom that you have for us. I want to pray, Father, that for those of us that haven't really reckoned with the forgiveness that we have received from you, I want to ask, Father, that you would reveal to us in your own time, in your own place, in your own circumstance. Show us that you do not want to hold anything against us, that you have forgiven us, and that your desire is to walk with us, is to be reconciled with us. I ask, Lord, that you would help us to walk in these ways of forgiveness, in this pattern of forgiveness, in this lifestyle of forgiveness, for our own sake. Amen.